It is so incredibly easy to just ruin a good story.
Oh, absolutely. We do it all the time.
We really do. And I mean, usually the way we ruin it is by just being impatient. Think about how we consume information today, especially you, the listener, right?
Yeah.
Whether you are scrolling through social media or reading a news article, we are completely wired for the highlight reel.
Yeah, we just want the good stuff.
Exactly. We want to skip the setup, bypass the dialogue, and just jump straight to the climax. We just want to see the explosion. And when it comes to, familiar historical or religious texts, we do the exact same thing. Take the famous story of water turning into wine, John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12.
Right. Everybody knows that one.
Right. Everyone knows the punchline. You picture the wedding, the sudden panic over the catering, and then boom, this miraculous, perfect vintage of wine just appears out of nowhere. But here's the thing. As readers, we have this really terrible habit of rushing straight to that miraculous moment without ever bothering to look at the stage layout. We want the magic trick, but we just don't look at the room it's being performed in.
We do. And honestly, it is a fatal flaw in how we read ancient literature. We strip the event of its architecture. We isolate the spectacle. And in doing so, we often completely miss the actual point the author was trying to make. I mean, the author didn't just jot down a cool magic trick. They built a highly structured narrative environment.
Okay, let's really unpack this, because jumping straight to the miracle is like walking into a movie theater halfway through a film.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, imagine walking in right as the main characters are having this massive screaming match in the rain, or right as a car goes flying off a cliff. Sure, it is exciting to watch, but if you don't know the genre of the film, if you don't know the setting or what happened in the opening scenes, you are going to fundamentally misunderstand the director's intent.
You really are.
You might think you are watching a high-octane action movie, when in reality, if you had watched from the beginning, you'd know it was a deeply philosophical drama. You missed the meaning because you ignored the setup.
That movie theater analogy is perfect for what we are looking at today, because in this deep dive, we're examining a very specific set of source materials detailing what is referred to academically as Module Point 1 Preliminary Preparation, specifically for the narrative of John 2.112. Now, I know the phrase Module Point 1 Preliminary Preparation sounds utterly tedious.
Oh, it sounds like the manual for a piece of Swedish furniture.
It does.
It sounds like something I'm going to toss in the recycling bin while I try to assemble the bookshelf using just my intuition, which, spoiler alert, never ends well.
Which is exactly why you end up with the wobbly bookshelves. But jokes aside, what this module represents is actually the absolute epistemological priority of interpretation.
Whoa, okay, stop right there. Epistemological priority. My eyes just glazed over, and I'm betting the listeners did too.
Fair enough, fair enough.
What does that actually mean for me, sitting on my couch with a cup of coffee, trying to read a book? Translate that into plain English.
Right, so epistemology is just the study of how we know what we know. So when I say epistemological priority, I mean this is the foundational step you must take before you can truly know what a text means.
Okay, so the very first step.
Exactly. Before we can debate theology, before we can argue about Greek grammar or dive into complex discourse analysis, we have to establish objective baseline controls. We have to treat this text not as some accidental, random collection of ancient oral traditions that just happen to get thrown together by an editor.
Right.
We have to treat it as a carefully engineered literary environment.
So it's the detective work before we even enter the crime scene. We are taping off the area. We are figuring out exactly what kind of room we are standing in, where the doors and windows are, and what era the house was built in, before we even start looking at the furniture or dusting for fingerprints.
That is exactly it. If we want to understand the interpretive integrity of this text, we have to respect the final form of the text as we actually have it. We have to prioritize authorial intent.
Meaning we care about what the original writer meant, not just what we want it to mean.
Precisely. We have to ask, what did the author actually build here? And to understand the architecture of this stage, the very first thing we have to do is find the walls.
Which makes total sense. I mean, if you don't know where the room begins and ends, you don't know what belongs inside it. So how do we find these invisible walls around Cana? Why do we need fences around a story in the first place?
We need fences because establishing the exact boundaries of a passage, what scholars refer to as passage delimitation, prevents a massive interpretive error. If you don't know where a story officially begins and ends, you run a very high risk of reading a narrative in total isolation.
And that's bad because it distorts the context.
Right. Or worse, you might import foreign context from other parts of the book that simply don't belong in this specific scene. The source materials point out that John 2.112 is isolated as a distinct, self-contained textual unit. And it's not arbitrary. It's based on very explicit structural, temporal, and spatial discontinuities.
So the author is actively waving a flag and telling us, start reading here and stop reading here. I want to look at that starting line, what the source calls the incipient boundary in verse 1.
Let's do it.
The Greek phrase used here is kai tehemera tetrei, which just translates to, and on the third day. Now, to a casual reader, myself included, that just sounds like a boring transition. On Tuesday, this happened. It feels like filler, but it's actually doing a lot of heavy lifting, isn't it?
It is doing an incredible amount of heavy lifting.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is how this explicit temporal shift functions as a hard structural reset. To understand why on the third day is so jarring, you have to look at the immediate context leading up to it, which is John chapter 1, verses 19 through 51.
Okay, what happens there?
In that opening chapter, you have this rapid, breathless, day-by-day succession of narrative callings.
Let's actually trace that because I think it helps to feel the rhythm of it. In chapter 1, John the Baptist testifies on day 1. Then the text says the next day, he points out Jesus as the Lamb of God. Then the next day, Jesus calls Philip and Nathanael. It's like this fast-paced montage sequence in a movie. Day 1, day 2, day 3, boom, boom, boom. The camera is just panning so quickly from one revelation to the next.
Right, it's a relentless sequential rhythm. And then suddenly, we hit verse 1 of chapter 2, and on the third day, this completely interrupts that rapid daily succession. It acts as a hard reset, signaling to the reader that the previous narrative movement, the gathering of the initial disciples, has concluded.
It's like slamming on the brakes.
It really is. A completely new narrative movement has commenced. Furthermore, as the source notes, this specific phrasing, arriving exactly when it does, completes an underlying Creation Week motif that the author subtly established in the opening chapter.
Wait, a Creation Week motif, like Genesis 1, that is wild. So you're saying the author is deliberately slowing us down to make a theological point about a new creation?
Yes, exactly. The Gospel of John famously opens with, in the beginning, a direct echo of Genesis. And then it sequences these early events over a span of days, culminating in this event on the third day of this sequence, bringing the total narrative timeline to roughly a week. The author is framing the arrival of Jesus and his first sign as a new Genesis, a new week of creation.
So the camera was panning quickly, tracking these daily callings, and now it completely stops, focuses on this wedding, and says, pay deep attention to this specific day. This is a foundational moment.
Yes.
Go. I'm sold on the front wall. On the third day is a massive structural marker. Now, what about the back wall? How does the author tell us the scene is over? The source calls this the terminus boundary in verse 12.
Verse 12 is honestly a masterclass in structural shifting. If you were a film director, this is exactly how you would write the scene transition. The narrative unit is brought to a formal close through a dense concentration of distinct changes.
Okay, walk me through them.
First, you have a geographical and spatial shift. The text says, Katabi is Capharnaum, meaning he went down to Capernaum.
Right, so we are physically leaving the location of the wedding. Cana is done. The party is over, or at least our time at the party is over.
Exactly. That draws a clear, hard geographic boundary around the localized events of Cana. But the author doesn't stop with geography. Second, there is a massive participant realignment.
A participant realignment. You mean the cast of characters on stage completely changes?
Yes. During the wedding narrative in verses 1 through 11, the focus was entirely on a localized celebration. You had the master of the banquet, the bridegroom, the servants drawing the water. But in verse 12, all of those local characters just vanished from the narrative.
They're just gone.
Gone. The focus shifts entirely to a mobile group. Jesus, his mother, his brothers, and his newly acquired disciples walking away from that space.
The extras clear out, the background actors go home, and we are just left with the core traveling group. That's a very clear cut.
And thirdly, there is the temporal demarcation. The text adds the phrase, kai ekeieminan ou polos hemeras, which means, and they stay there a few days.
Another timing detail.
Right, and this isn't just a throwaway detail. It functions as a macrostructural transition zone. It formally concludes the Galilean sign narrative, providing a brief, quiet pause in the text before Jesus pivots dynamically toward Jerusalem for the highly confrontational temple cleansing that begins in verse 13.
So the author is locking us in. Geographically, socially, and temporally, verses 1 through 12 are a sealed room. The doors are shut. And from what I understand from our source material, this isn't just one modern scholar's clever opinion. The textual stability of these boundaries is rock solid.
That's a crucial point to bring up. When we do this kind of rigorous analysis, we have to make sure the text we are reading is actually what was written and hasn't been altered over thousands of years of copying.
Right, because if it was changed, this whole structural argument falls apart.
Exactly. But a critical audit of the textual apparatus, specifically looking at the Nestle Allen 28th edition and the United Bible Society's 5th edition, which are the absolute gold standards for the Greek New Testament, reveals no significant manuscript variance here.
Meaning, when we look at all the ancient scraps of papyrus and the old scrolls, nobody was adding or deleting these verses.
None. There are no omissions, no later scribal insertions or disruptions affecting verses 1 or 12 in the ancient manuscript tradition. This text space stands as a locked, cohesive structural unit across the board.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to put on my skeptic's hat for a second and push back on behalf of you, the listener. We've spent all this time talking about geographic shifts, temporal demarcations, and manuscript variants. I'm struggling with this.
Tell me why.
Well, you're telling me that noticing a phrase like "they stayed a few days" actually matters. It just sounds like a random historical detail a guy wrote down to get from point A to point B. I mean, does knowing it's a third day or that they went to Capernaum really change how I read the story of the water and the wine? It feels like we're obsessing over the stage directions instead of watching the actual play.
That is a highly perceptive pushback, and it's a very fair critique. Why should anyone care about the stage directions? Because these boundaries are the very things that keep us from ripping the story out of its literary socket.
Oh, okay, how so?
Think about how this story is usually taught or talked about. If you ignore the boundaries, you might be tempted to read the wedding at Cana as just a random standalone anecdote. You might think, oh, Jesus is just a really great party guest who stepped in to save a social faux pas.
Right, like it's just a heartwarming story about Jesus caring about everyday problems, a nice catering miracle.
Exactly. But by locking down these boundaries, by acknowledging that the author intentionally fenced this story in, we are forced to ask a much deeper question. Why did the author build this specific room? Why did he place it exactly here, right after the call of the disciples in chapter 1 and right before the clearing of the temple in chapter 2?
I see.
The boundaries guard the objective intent of the author. They force us to read the text on its own terms, within its own sequence, rather than turning it into a disconnected fable.
I see. If it's deliberately placed, then its placement means something. So we found the walls of the specific room. The room is secure. But to understand the architecture of this stage, we now need to zoom out. We need to see where this room sits in the overall floor plan of John's Gospel, which leads us perfectly into what the sources call the literary context.
Yes, understanding where this narrative sits on the macro map prevents interpretive isolation. It ensures we are respecting the authorial design on both the immediate, local level and the wider book level structure.
Let's start local, the micro context. If I am reading this book cover to cover, where did I just come from before walking into this wedding?
You just came from the inaugural gathering of Jesus' first disciples at the end of chapter 1. And specifically, we have to look at the very end of that chapter, John 1:50 and 51.
What happens there?
In that passage, Jesus is having a conversation with Nathanael. Nathanael has just declared Jesus to be the Son of God simply because Jesus saw him sitting under a fig tree. And Jesus replies with a massive, staggering promise. He promises Nathanael and the other newly called disciples that they will see greater things than these and that they will witness heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man.
You will see greater things. That is a huge theological cliffhanger. And then, literally the very next sentence in the text is the start of chapter 2. And on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana.
That is so fascinating. So John 2:112 is the immediate historical down payment on that massive theological promise.
It absolutely is. Imagine being Nathaniel. You've just been promised you're going to see heaven open, so you're probably expecting fire to fall from the sky or some massive geopolitical upheaval.
Right, some huge cosmic event. Instead, you get invited to a village wedding. But it is here, at this wedding, that the newly called disciples transition from just hearing declarations about Jesus' identity to actively observing his miraculous authority. It is the very first proof of concept for the promise made to Nathanael.
That immediately changes how I read the story. I'm not just watching Jesus at a party. I'm watching Jesus fulfill a cosmic promise to his new followers in the most unexpected setting.
Okay, so that is the immediate micro-connection. But the source material also points out a much larger macro context. It talks about the overarching structure of the Book of Signs and introduces this concept called a Cana to Cana inclusio. Now, I've heard the word inclusio before, but let's break it down for the listener.
An inclusio is a brilliant literary device. Think of it as a structural loop, or a set of brackets that an ancient author used to frame a specific section of text. Remember, ancient texts didn't have chapter headings, bold text, or bullet points.
Right, none of our modern
Right.
formatting. Exactly. Authors had to use literary patterns to group ideas together. In this case, the author intentionally designs the initial movement of Jesus' public ministry using a geographical and thematic bookend that spans all the way from John 1.19 over to John 4.54.
Okay, so a giant pair of brackets. Let's walk through the phases of this loop. Phase 1, according to our notes, is John 1.1-51.
Right. This is the foundational section. It details the calling of the first disciples and, as we just discussed, establishes that overarching theological promise of greater revelations to come.
Then we hit phase 2, the text we are focusing on, John 2.1-12, the wedding at Cana.
This is the central introductory section of the opening frame. It marks the first sign in Cana of Galilee. It serves as the immediate historical fulfillment of Jesus' promise through the initial manifestation of his divine glory.
And then the story moves on. Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he talks to people, he travels. But then we get to phase 3, which jumps all the way to John 4.4654.
Yes, this is the concluding section of the loop. In this passage, at the end of chapter 4, Jesus heals an official's son. But what is critical for our structural understanding is the geography. The text explicitly goes out of its way to record this as the second sign at Cana, intentionally looping back to the exact same geographical setting of the first sign to formally close the macrostructural literary inclusio.
Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I am grasping the real weight of this, because it's easy to just say, oh, it's a loop, but why does it matter? Think of this inclusio like a pair of matching heavy bookends on your living room shelf. You've got the first sign at Cana acting as the left bookend, and the second sign at Cana acting as the right bookend.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
If an author goes to the trouble of carving these massive matching bookends and placing them precisely where they are effectively forcing you to read everything between them through a very specific lens.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your analogy is spot on. And we have to ask, what exactly is sitting on the shelf between those two bookends? What stories are sandwiched inside this Cana inclusio?
Well, there's a lot.
Yes. You have the violent cleansing of the temple in Jerusalem. You have the famous late-night theological dialogue with Nicodemus about being born again in chapter 3. And you have the profoundly culturally transgressive encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well in chapter 4.
Those are massive, iconic stories. They are some of the most famous narratives in the entire Bible.
They are. And this macrostructural frame alerts the reader that those intervening narratives cannot be read in a vacuum. They must be interpreted in light of the theological realities unveiled at Cana.
Wow.
The authorial design is basically shouting at us, do not forget what happened at the wedding. Keep the transformation of the water into wine in your mind as you watch Jesus clear the temple. Keep the idea of the replacing the old in your mind as he talks to Nicodemus about being born of water and spirit. Keep it in mind as he offers living water to the Samaritan woman.
Not only that, but it completely shifts how you view the temple cleansing. I mean, if Cana is about Jesus bringing a new, joyful wine to replace the empty purification jars of the old system, then the very next story, Jesus literally driving the old sacrificial system out of the temple, is making the exact same point, just on a national scale. It's all connected. The architecture here is just brilliant.
It really is. It demonstrates that we're dealing with a highly sophisticated literary document, not just a random diary of events.
Okay, so we have seen where the story is placed. We've built the walls. We've looked at the bookends. But to truly understand its purpose, we have to understand what kind of story the author is actually telling. Because if you misidentify the genre, you misinterpret the meaning. So let's deconstruct the genre identification of this passage. We have to talk about signs versus miracles.
This is perhaps the most crucial distinction in the entire preliminary preparation module. The generic classification of John 2.1 and 12 governs and heavily restrains our expectations as readers.
Right, because if you read Matthew, Mark, or Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, you see Jesus doing incredible supernatural things all the time. He heals lepers, he calms storms, and we generally treat those as standard miracle stories. But John does something very different here. He explicitly defines the genre of this pericope.
Wait, let me stop you right there. You just used the word pericope. Let's make sure we clarify that for the listener before we move on.
Ah, right, my bad. I slipped into the academic jargon. A pericope is basically just a fancy word for a self-contained story or passage in a book. It's the chunk of text we are looking at.
Spot on.
So John defines the genre of this specific chunk of text in verse 11. He doesn't call it a miracle. He uses the specific Greek term semeion, which translates to a sign.
And that distinction between a standard miracle and a Johannine sign is absolutely vital. It changes the entire interpretive game. In ancient literature, a standard miracle narrative is primarily designed to evoke awe. It focuses on the raw display of supernatural power, or the immediate alleviation of a specific human suffering, healing a terrible disease, casting out a demon, calming a deadly storm.
The focus is entirely on the action itself and the immediate result. The crowd goes, look at this amazing thing that just happened. Look at how powerful this person is.
Exactly. The power is the point. The relief of suffering is the point. But a Johannine sign narrative operates completely differently. Yes, it involves the supernatural, but it functions primarily as a profound literary and historical pointer.
Okay, think about it like this. Treating a Johannine sign like a basic miracle is like driving down the highway on a road trip. You're driving through the desert, and you see this massive, beautifully painted billboard on the side of the road that says, Grand Canyon, 10 miles.
Okay, I like where this is going.
And instead of continuing to drive, you pull your car over to the shoulder, you get out, and you just stare at the billboard. You are amazed by the shiny, reflective paint on the metal. You admire the font choice. You are just mesmerized by the construction of the sign itself.
They're completely distracted.
Right. And you take pictures of the sign, and you go home and tell everyone, I saw the most amazing sign today. But you never actually followed it to go look at the Grand Canyon. You missed the entire point of why the sign existed in the first place.
That is precisely what we do when we obsess over the mechanics of turning water into wine. We are standing on the side of the highway staring at the reflective paint. The genre of semeion dictates that every single historical detail in this text, the wine, the jars, the dialogue with Mary, the role of the servants, is intentionally chosen by the author to point past the physical event itself. It is pointing toward a deeper Christological reality.
So we aren't supposed to read this and just think, wow, Jesus would be a great guy to have at a party. He can fix catering issues. We are supposed to look at where the sign is pointing.
Yes. The sign demands historical grammatical examination not to satisfy our scientific curiosity about the mechanics of the miracle. I mean, the text doesn't care about the molecular process of H2O becoming fermented grape juice.
Right, it's not a chemistry textbook.
We aren't meant to figure that out. The sign exists to expose the inner reality of Jesus' divine identity. In John's vocabulary, this is his doxa, his glory. The sign reveals the glory.
I love that phrase. The sign reveals the glory. But that begs the question, what is that glory? It's not just a glowing aura around him. To fully grasp the magnitude of what this sign is pointing to, and to truly see that glory, we have to step out of the literary theory for a moment. We have to step into the high-stakes, sweat-inducing, real-world pressure cooker in which this sign was actually performed. We need to talk about real history.
Moving into the historical and cultural background is where the text really comes alive. But our source material gives us a very stern warning here. As we look at the history, we have to deeply insulate our interpretation from speculative, modern historical reconstructions. We must anchor our analysis strictly to verifiable first-century Jewish customs and geographical realities.
Right, no making things up to fit a modern sermon illustration. No psychoanalyzing the bride and groom based on 21st century relationship dynamics. We stick to the historical facts. Let's start with the geographical orientation. The text specifies that this happens in Cana of Galilee. I always pictured Cana as this bustling, important city because the story is so famous. But looking at the sources, I was shocked to find out it was basically a dusty truck stop. What is the verifiable reality of Cana?
Cana of Galilee was intensely obscure. It was a low-status agricultural village located up in the hills. It was far removed from Jerusalem, which was the grand center of religious and political power. It wasn't even a bustling commercial and fishing hub like Capernaum. It was an ordinary, dusty, small, inconsequential town.
Which sets up a massive rhetorical contrast right out of the gate.
It does. Think back to the prologue of John's Gospel, just a few paragraphs before this story. John has just introduced Jesus as the cosmic, pre-existent Word through whom the entire universe was made.
The ultimate power.
Yes. And the inaugural manifestation of this cosmic Word's divine glory doesn't occur in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. It doesn't happen in a Roman palace or a Greek amphitheater. It happens in a small, ordinary domestic space in a backwater village.
That is a profound theological statement all on its own. The divine glory invading the mundane, the cosmic intersecting with the rural. But let's talk about this ordinary domestic space, because while the town might be small, the event happening inside this house was anything but simple. We have to outline the social catastrophe of a first-century wedding.
This is where our modern cultural lens really fails us, and why historical context is so vital. When we think of a wedding today, we think of a 45-minute ceremony at a church or a venue, followed by a 4-hour reception. You eat some dry chicken, you dance to a DJ, you eat a piece of cake, and you go home by midnight.
Right. And if the caterer messes up or if they run out of the good wine and switch to the cheap stuff, people might grumble to each other at their tables. It's a minor inconvenience. Maybe the couple leaves a bad Yelp review for the venue later, but everyone survives.
Exactly. But in first-century Jewish culture, a wedding was not a 4-hour event. It was a multi-day community celebration. It often lasted up to an entire week. And the hosting family, usually the groom's family, bore an absolute non-negotiable legal and social obligation to provide continuous hospitality to the entire community for the duration of that week.
A whole week of hosting the entire town.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the central symbol of that hospitality, the absolute core element of the feast, was an adequate flowing supply of wine.
So when John 2.3 notes the depletion of the wine, when Mary comes to Jesus and simply says, they have no more wine, this is not a minor catering hiccup.
It is a devastating social catastrophe. In an honor-shame culture, failing to provide for your guests brought immediate, lifelong public shame upon the newlywed couple and their families. It signaled to the community that this family was financially insolvent, unable to meet their basic social obligations. It was a public declaration of inadequacy.
The source material even mentions that it could expose the family to lawsuits. Wait, hold on. Lawsuits over lack of wine? That sounds incredibly intense. Are we sure we aren't imposing modern legal anxieties and litigiousness onto an ancient text? People suing each other over a party foul seems a bit much.
It sounds absurd to us, but what's fascinating here is that we are absolutely not imposing modern anxieties. The intense honor-shame dynamics of first-century Mediterranean culture are rigorously documented by historians. Reciprocity was everything.
Like a social contract.
Exactly. When you attended a wedding and brought a gift, you were entering into an unspoken but very real social contract that you would be hosted lavishly. If the host failed to provide the expected standard of celebration, it was considered a literal breach of that contract. They owed you. The historical metrics of financial and social ruin in this scenario are entirely verifiable and accurate.
So the narrative tension in this room is absolute suffocating panic. The groom's family is staring down the barrel of social excommunication and financial ruin. The whisper network in the village is about to start. That puts a whole new spin on Mary's urgency. Okay, so that is the immense pressure of the setting. Now let's look at the props on the stage. The source material spends a lot of time on the physical vessels present at the scene. The 6 stone water jars.
Yes. John specifically notes in verse 6 that there were 6 stone water jars set there. And he adds a crucial explanatory phrase, kata ton katharisman ton iodion, which means for the purification rites of the Jews.
Now, again, to a modern reader, a jar is a jar. It holds liquid. It's a bucket. Why does the author go out of his way to care that they were made of stone?
Because this detail is grounded in highly specific, non-speculative, historical, archaeological, and Levitical data. It is a massive clue. To understand this, we have to look back at Leviticus 11.33 and the first-century rabbinic consensus regarding ritual purity.
Okay, let's get into the weeds here. How did purity laws govern dishware in the first century?
Common pottery, the kind most people used every day, was made of fired clay. According to the Levitical law, clay easily contracted ritual impurity. Because clay is porous, if a ritually impure person touched a clay vessel or something impure like a dead insect fell into it, the vessel absorbed that impurity.
Like a sponge.
Exactly like a sponge. You couldn't just wash it out with soap and water. The impurity was considered permanently absorbed into the material of the pot.
So what did you have to do?
You had to smash it. The law required the clay vessel to be utterly destroyed. So if you were using clay for your large water reservoirs for purification washing, it was highly risky and potentially very expensive if someone bumped into it and it constantly had to be replaced.
Wait, if clay absorbs it, they had to smash it. That's like realizing your expensive Tupperware has a permanent spaghetti stain that makes it ritually impure, and the only option is to throw it in the wood chipper. That sounds exhausting and expensive, but stone is different.
Completely different. Stone was uniquely classified by the rabbis as entirely immune to ritual defilement. It was solid rock. It was not porous in the way clay was. Therefore, it could not absorb impurity. If you wanted a vessel that was permanently set apart to maintain cleansing water and avoid constant contamination, you invested in massive stone jars.
And these weren't small, right?
No, these jars were huge, holding 20 to 30 gallons each. Carving a stone jar of that size was an incredibly labor-intensive and expensive process.
So, the presence of these 6 specific, massive stone jars tells us something vital about the family hosting this wedding. It's not just a random detail about the decor.
It demonstrates that this household was strictly, rigorously compliant with the rigid purity boundaries of Old Covenant Judaism. They had invested heavily, both financially and practically, in remaining ritually pure. These jars represent the absolute apex of the Old Covenant system. They were the height of external religious observance, sitting right there in the courtyard, designed to wash away the dirt and impurity of the outside world.
It is so wild how much information is packed into the phrase 6 stone jars. It's like seeing a family today with a massive, state-of-the-art security system. It tells you exactly what they value and what they fear.
Precisely. And remember, those jars were empty. The old system of purification had run dry at the exact moment a social catastrophe was unfolding.
So when we step back and look at all of this together, with the boundaries locked in, the macro map drawn to show the Cana inclusio, the genre defined as a sign pointing to glory, and this intense historical reality of honor, shame, and stone purity exposed, how does this fundamentally change the way you read the text?
It transforms reading from a passive, consumer activity into an active, objective investigation. When you do this module point 1 preparation, you silence your modern biases. You stop asking, what does this text mean to me in the 21st century? And you start hearing the author's unaltered intent from the first century.
You let the text speak for itself.
Yes, by isolating the text, mapping those literary loops, and grounding the crisis in first-century cultural metrics, we discover a meticulously engineered architectural foundation.
It really is an architecture. You realize that John didn't waste a single word. Every geographic shift, every temporal marker like the third day, every mention of a stone jar is a load-bearing pillar in the theological house he is building. Trusting this architecture allows you, the listener, to see the text with incredible clarity.
We aren't just looking at the reflective paint on the highway sign anymore.
Right, we aren't just amazed by the magic trick. We're actually looking at the canyon it's pointing to. We are looking at the divine identity of the Word made flesh.
We are finally equipped to see the doxa, the glory that the sign was designed to reveal.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to consider on your own. Think about this one historical detail we just discussed. The text tells us those stone jars represented the absolute, untouchable apex of the Old Covenant purity system. They were designed solely for external cleansing, for washing hands and feet.
Yeah, strictly for the outside.
And yet, Jesus uses those exact jars as the vessels for his new wine. If those stone jars represent the absolute limit of the old system's ability to purify a person from the outside, what does it mean that Jesus fills them to the absolute brim and transforms their contents into something meant to be joyfully consumed and internalized at a feast? He takes the water of external washing and turns it into the wine of internal joy. We'll leave you to ponder that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.